Hello, everyone in Austin. I'm with Chairman Michael McCaul. We're both sad that we can't be there with you in person, but we'll try our best with the magic of the internet to also get audience questions in here. We're at the U.S. Capitol, where there's going to be a lot of work going on this weekend, I think. I want to start with the sort of news of the day. President Zelensky was in town yesterday. You met with him. Tell us about it. What was your impression?
Well, thanks, Jenny. Let me thank the Texas Tribune as well, and to everybody in Austin. I'm thinking about y'all, especially tomorrow against the Baylor Bears. I hope the Longhorns win. So President Zelensky came into Washington, met with both Republican and Democratic leadership, including myself. It was a very small meeting, but very impactful. And my question to him was, it seems to me that we're in a war of attrition right now. And that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants a war of attrition to break the will of the American people and the European people. And so my question to him was, what do you need from this administration? I've been a critic, as you know, that the weapons have gone in too slowly. It's impacted the counteroffensive. They had to delay it. The Russians put the minefields in and all the defensive mechanisms. So President Zelensky described a scene of, my soldiers are going in with no air cover. And at nighttime, by hand, they have to take the landmines out. We would never send our troops into a situation like that. And so when it got down to brass tacks about what do you specifically need, he said, I need air cover, and that would be the F-16s. A year ago, I told the administration, at least start training pilots. So if you do decide to put F-16s in, you'll be prepared. And then the ATACMS, the longer range artillery is what they desperately need right now, because the Iranian drones are being fired out of Crimea. And that's what's really damaging the Ukrainian forces. And they really can't attack those installations in Crimea. And until they get the ATACMS, it's going to be a lopsided. We didn't think the Ukrainians would last more than 4 days, by the way. And here we are, it's over a year and a half. They've proven that they have the resiliency, they have the fight within them. They've decimated 50% of the Russian military without one American soldier, and with less than 5% of our Pentagon budget. So I know there are a lot of people, there's some dissension on both sides of the aisle about this, but I think in terms of our long-term security interests, it's very important, because as you and I went to Taiwan and heard from the leaders over there, what happens in Ukraine directly impacts what happens in Taiwan. We see this unholy alliance now with Chairman Xi and Putin, and also the Ayatollah and Kim Jong-un. We just saw Putin, beg to Kim Jong-un for weapons, and the Ayatollah. Iran's in Russia right now making drones, manufacturing drones. So this is really the four adversary nations against the free world, is the way I see it.
I want to get into a lot of what you just touched on in detail, but what was the most surprising takeaway that you had from your conversation with President Zelensky yesterday?
I've met with him many times. He's always very authentic, very honest, and a lot of moral courage and integrity, in my judgment. One of the comments he made was maybe good news, if true, and that is he thinks that they are making progress, but it's slow. That he thinks that by the winter, when the fighting stops, that they will make significant progress in both the Donbass, that's eastern Ukraine, and then southern Ukraine, of course, Mariupol, and down towards Crimea. Their ultimate goal is to cut the land bridge off, the supply line. If they can do that, then they cut the supplies to Crimea and the Donbass, and then they can. What I want is a plan for victory. When I talk to a lot of constituents, they're like, look, I support this, but I don't want it to go on forever. And I share that sentiment. And it doesn't have to be as long as it takes. It shouldn't take that long. And if we give them everything they need, there needs to be the path to victory. And that's what people want to see.
So let's unpack this. There's a $24 billion funding request currently in limbo. The president said yesterday, after he met with President Zelensky, that he's counting on the good judgment of the United States Congress, and there's no alternative. You just mentioned some of the dissension. While we see, the majority of the majority actually still supporting this ongoing support for Ukraine. You're an adamant supporter of this aid. How do you engage with the small number of these hardline members of your party that have problems with it? Are you having conversations behind the scenes to compel them to keep going? That this is in the need of the United States' best interest and the need of the free world's best interest? What can you tell us?
Right. I think it's a fair question, and I deal with that with my constituents. I mean, I think the majority of the majorities do support this effort, but I think the way this has been managed by the current administration is drawing a lot of things into question. I will tell you, the leadership at the room on both sides of the aisle yesterday are very supportive of this effort, but we do need accountability. We do need a plan for victory. We need to know what the mission and strategic objective is. And those are fair questions. And, in the state foreign ops appropriation bill, we put language in there that deals, the administration needs to come forward and explain why this is in the national security interest of the United States. Now, I personally, my father was a World War II veteran, a bombardier, B-17, bombed the Nazis. This is the largest invasion we've seen in Europe since my dad's war, since World War II, and the greatest threat to the Pacific since World War II. So there are a lot of historical parallels. And I was in Poland right after the invasion, watching all these refugees pouring into Poland, just mothers and children and wives. And the Poles, it was interesting. They said, this is like 1939. This is just like 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. If we don't stop them here, then we will have to put our troops on the ground to stop them somewhere else, especially if it's NATO. And I would argue that we've made a lot of progress without one American soldier. I support this because I don't want American troops on the ground in Eastern Europe.
Are there arguments from the dissenters in your party that resonate with you?
Yeah, there are. Again, the majority, I think, is supportive. There are dissenters. There are some people whose minds I won't be able to change. But I think those who are in the middle just want some assurance about accountability. We have 3 inspector generals that I stood up in a Deloitte audit, by the way. So far, it's been in-use monitoring with the military equipment barcoded. But they also just want to know what is our strategic objective in Ukraine, and what is the plan for victory? Americans don't like to lose, and they don't want to be in a long, dragged out war, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan. I would argue Ukraine's very different from Afghanistan, by the way. But there is this false dichotomy argument that somehow we can't help our freedom and democracy versus tyranny because we have a problem with the southwest border. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I've been very harsh on the administration about their mishandling of the southwest border. But I think we do both. And interestingly, the first president to give lethal aid to Ukraine, $300 million that I signed off on, because I signed off on all foreign military sales, was the previous administration.
You said there are some minds that you can't change. What if you explain to us the path forward? Everyone's of course watching it. President Zelensky now gone. What are the options? What can you do to make the next supplemental, okay for some of these minds that could be changed, that are currently in the middle, that you are trying to compel to continue support?
Well, and that's a great question. That's why we put language on I think this passes in an appropriations package, some supplemental. All the political machinations, we can talk for 30 minutes about how that could happen. I do probably think the Senate will they're very adamant about it. I think they'll probably put Ukraine funding in the Senate, send it over to the House. But we need language in there that has accountability, that requires the administration to come forward with a plan, path for victory, a strategic objective. But we're also going to write weapon systems in. It was unanimous at the table yesterday, President Zelensky. that we need to give him ATACMS, the longer range artillery to hit the Iranian drones coming out of Crimea. They were killing innocent civilians. And by the way, they've kidnapped 30,000 children, put them in indoctrination camps in Russia. That to me, that's one of the elements of genocide. And the war crimes, as the prosecutor general Bucha saw the mass graves, the bombing maternity hospitals and schools. Now I've seen some of the children that have survived these indoctrination camps, and it's very disturbing. So I think we have the moral high ground here. I think at the end of the day, Jenny, that we're on the right side of history. And maybe the politics are rough, but you know what? I got elected for a reason, to lead, and I want to be on the right side of history, with this. And so if we have this language, getting back to your question, I think in the supplemental and also prescribing these specific weapon systems that they need to win, not a slow, drawn out process that Jake Sullivan and the president have done, but something that will jumpstart this thing.
So would that then address some of the dissenters' criticism that, it's blank checks that just come in perpetuity?
Yes.
And that would also, how would that play with your constituents? You just mentioned that they do also have questions about how long can this go on?
And those are legitimate questions. And I have the same questions. Been very frustrated with this administration because what they're doing is prolonging this thing. And it has turned into a war that Ukraine was winning to, like a war of attrition. And I think that's the last thing the American people want to see. But it's also what Putin does want to see. That's what he wants. So we can't play into his hands. And, I'm backed by people like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien in the Trump administration, General Jack Keane. It takes my position. I think I'm in pretty good company here, but we all share the same sentiment that this thing can't drag out forever. And we're not, they dropped their supplemental on us. We have the power of the purse in the House, and we're going to decide the terms and conditions.
You mentioned, or at least Speaker McCarthy going into the meeting with President Zelensky mentioned that there has to be some accountability, some plan forward. We're not just keep doing this, without sort of a strategy. How did President Zelensky sort of perceive that ask, and what did he have to tell you in response? What's his plan? He's the guy, of course, leading the whole effort. What's his plan for victory?
Well, the counteroffensive is to cut the land bridge, so the supply line's cut. He thinks they're making, and they will by winter, significant progress in the east, in the Donbass, and also in the south. But without the longer-range artillery, he was very clear that I cannot stop these Iranian drones out of Crimea. I'm not going to use them to fire into Russia. That's part of the deal. Any weapon systems we give them, they can't use to fire into Russia itself. And so he actually welcomed my question, which was, he's not one to say that I need this, this, and this. But when I asked him the question, he could answer that. And it was very revealing, I think, to the speaker and the minority leader. And at the end of the conversation, the speaker was like, okay, let me get this straight. You need the air cover, you need the ATACMS, longer range, and you need mine clearing equipment. That's what they need. And so, the Colin Powell doctrine, I agree with. You're either in, all in, or you're out. And so I don't want to go into a conflict with one hand tied behind my back. And that's the problem. The dissension within my party is that they see a president it's been too slow, and they see it mismanaged. And some of them just don't want to be a part of this. But we can't turn a blind eye to Ukraine and allow naked aggression in a sovereign nation to exist in the 21st century.
So let's talk about the ATACMS. Obviously, there was probably some hope on the Ukrainian side that President Zelensky would come to Washington and there could be an announcement, given that we know this has been under consideration for a long time. There wasn't an announcement yesterday. Now we're seeing reports that there are some versions of the ATACMS potentially being provided. It's unclear how many and when. Explain to us your conversations with the administration on how did we get here? We didn't get there yesterday. What did the president need assurance on that might have gotten him over the finish line today, given
Well, I hope, and I have not received a formal notification. I hope it's the longer range ATACMS. What I'm concerned about, based on my conversations, is that it's a version of the ATACMS, but at half of the distance. So the ATACMS that Zelensky needs are 300 kilometers to reach Crimea. The ones that I know have been on the president's desk, I believe, are half that range. With cluster munitions, which would be very helpful, it just won't have the range necessary to take out these installations in Crimea. So, we'll see what they do. But if I can walk you back, so here we are over a year and a half ago, and they wouldn't even put stingers in, right? We had, it's too provocative, and then oh, javelins too provocative, but they eventually went in. HIMARS, the shorter range artillery, too provocative. Oh, okay, we'll put them in. And then the F-16s. And so, for God's sakes, at least train the pilots. The F-16s, absolutely not. Congressman will never do that. And then the G7 pressured Biden into doing it. We're not sending any of our F-16s, by the way. We're just releasing the F-16s that we sold, say, to the Netherlands to put in there. But they don't have the pilots. It takes 6 months to train them. So this too provocative argument has greatly slowed down the progress of the war. And I think it's hurt the will of the American people.
And remind us again what the timeline is for the F-16s, where we stand on that now for the Ukrainians.
Well, it's in the Netherlands. The condition is that they have to have the trained pilots before they will send the F-16s in. It takes about 6 months to train. We're talking about January.
Okay, so training ongoing.
So it will not be helpful for this counteroffensive.
Got it, okay. You mentioned that there is a deal with every weapon system you give to President Zelensky that he's not going to use it into Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that actually the holdup of why the administration seems to potentially slow walk this? That there isn't is the deal clear? Is it a very clear commitment by President Zelensky, or is there any hesitation that you would say, justifies some of the hesitation on providing XYZ weapon?
I find it interesting that they are unwilling to give them anything that could hit Crimea. So what does that indicate to me? I've heard, some discussions from the National Security Council that, maybe Crimea, but Crimea is not a pro-Russia. Crimea is Ukraine. Go back to the 2014 invasion. And I think that's the great debate within the National Security Council is, okay, Crimea, is that Russia or is it Ukrainian? And
they say very clearly it's Ukrainian.
Yeah, I think it is too. But it's interesting how they won't give them anything that can hit Crimea. Are they waiting to use Crimea as a bargaining chip in a negotiation? That's another discussion I've heard, as well. I just find it interesting they won't give them anything. Now, the Secretary of Defense in the UK, Ben Wallace, and I have had really good discussions. He said, look, if your administration's not going to do this, I am. So he's given them what are called storm shadows, but they have to be delivered by the air, not by the ground, but air. And that would be by the MiGs. Remember the MiGs? We're not going to put MiGs in. Remember that one? We finally did it, but it took a year and a half.
So the ATACMS, if it's not the longer range ones that President Zelensky has been asking for, if it's a different version, what is your assessment of what it will do to the war in terms of helping the counteroffensive and timeline also for when that would get there?
The long range artillery would greatly speed up this effort. And that's why I've been very persistent about these ATACMS. We passed a resolution out of the Foreign Affairs Committee unanimously, bipartisan, calling for the use of longer range artillery ATACMS in Ukraine. And I hope, I think, Jenny, they're going to come around eventually, but they have to wring their hands for 6 months. And in the meantime, people are dying over there. It's pretty horrific. And it's almost like trench warfare, World War I. And, there are a lot of children that are at risk. And I think it would, if they had the right equipment, they could greatly speed this thing up. Because at the end of the day, the will of the Ukrainians is far stronger than the will of the Russians. Now, they have more bodies in Russia, but they don't have the will.
You were mentioning, we hear a lot of from the president and also from lawmakers that you'll stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We have
I never
reported,
say as long as it takes. That's president. I mean, I say it shouldn't take that long if we did this right.
so I'm interested in your assessment on this. We've reported that the G7 got together. They were just at the United Nations, of course, in New York, and there's a view that the war could drag on for years, maybe into 2030. Do you agree with that?
I mean, there are some. When I was in, I was in Sweden. They hopefully will be ascended into NATO in October. I was in Finland. They're the newest NATO, and these two countries are going to bring a tremendous amount of power to NATO, both militarily and economically. And I was in the Netherlands looking at the F-16 operation, and I think Putin's objective was to weaken and divide NATO. I've never seen NATO stronger than it is today and larger. And so I think in that sense, Putin has been defeated. Again, 50% of his military has been decimated without one American soldier. And so, if this goes on, and there are some that I talk to, some generals in NATO that think it could go on for a while. And that's why I urge we have to do this faster. Time is not on our side. And I told Jake Sullivan this too. The longer this drags out, the less will from the American people you're going to have. So you can wring your hands for months, or you can just give them what they need to win. Americans like a winner. They don't like a loser. What's the objective? To defeat Russia from its invasion.
So thinking not that far ahead, but to next year, we're seeing right now how it's playing out to get enough support to continue supporting Ukraine with the outstanding 24 billion request. Next year, of course, we're in an election year, so I'm curious what your crystal ball is on, if you do manage to get this done this year, and we're already seeing how it's politicized, definitely in the GOP primary and the presidential race. How much more difficult will it be to do this with politics hovering over the whole thing in an election year?
Very difficult. And that's why I urged the White House to not do this every 3 months. Excuse me, I'd rather have a up or down vote for the next year. Don't come to us every 3 months with this, because it's difficult to accomplish. And so, either we're going to support this effort or we're going to get out. If we're going to support it, let's do it right to win. And let's not vote every 3 months on this. And so I think that's a desire of the House. And quite frankly, I can't speak for the speaker, but I do think he knows his conference, and we would prefer this to be a year-long funding.
And what's the response you get from the administration on this?
I don't think they've really thought that out, to be honest with you. I think they just want to do this incrementally in installments. But I can tell you from the political standpoint, and you're right, in an election year. Now, most of the presidential candidates I saw do support this effort, and they have the same argument I do, but some don't. And so that's another reason why Putin's like, hey, war of attrition's great. I'll see who wins the White House, and maybe I can cut a good deal.
And what does that mean, sort of like, if you had to look into how much more difficult it will be next year, what does that mean for a world where we potentially would have to do the same for Taiwan, provide them with aid? Do you see, is there more support for doing this for Taiwan, or is everything now at risk of getting sort of like bogged down by intra-party fighting?
I think it's important to note that the supplemental, every time we do this, what we are doing is the majority of the funding actually goes into modernizing and upgrading our own stockpiles, our weapons stockpiles in the United States. What we've put into Ukraine are Eastern NATO weaponry, old Soviet stuff, quite frankly, and then replenished our NATO countries with modern weapons. Same thing from the United States. And so again, for those who, why is this important? Because when you and I were in Asia, every leader said what happens in Ukraine will directly impact Chairman Xi's calculation whether to invade Taiwan. So that takes it from the European theater now into the Pacific. So it's a grave threat. And if it's not met with deterrence, when you project weakness, you invite aggression historically. I personally think after Afghanistan, after the debacle and the fall and the surrender to the Taliban, that we are projecting weakness. And just months after that fall, we saw in satellite imagery the Russian Federation moving towards Ukraine. We knew then that the invasion was going to happen. And what else do we see? Beijing Olympics, Chairman Xi in China, Putin cut this unholy alliance, and they're in this together. And so is the Ayatollah, and so is Kim Jong-un. So I think you can't look at this just in the prism of Ukraine. It has a broader geopolitical challenge to it. I worry that we have no deterrence in Taiwan. I signed off on weapon systems over 4 years ago that have yet to go into Taiwan. When I met with President Tsai, and you were there, she said, "Where are my weapons? I paid for them." She actually buys them. This is a defense industrial base issue. That's our ability to manufacture weapon systems. In my judgment, it takes way too long and it's broken, and I'm trying to fix it so we have more speed and agility and innovation. It doesn't have to be the big 5 prime contractors. It can also be smaller, more agile, innovative contractors. Without these weapon systems, Taiwan is naked, and Chairman Xi knows that. Now, we do have our nuclear submarines in the Pacific, and that's the only thing that can outmatch him right now. But it worries me when I see things like the hypersonic weapon that was launched by China that went around the world with precision and landed, that can carry a nuclear payload that we can't stop, and we don't have one. Now, we're building this stuff at Texas A&M Rellis campus. However, at what time, and this is the irony of ironies, the export control laws, right? Guess where they got the technology to build the hypersonic weapon? It's built on the backbone of American technology. The spy plane that they allowed to traverse across the continent before it was shot down, we found American component parts in the spy plane. Everything they have, they're very good, not so great at innovation. They're very good at stealing our technology and intellectual property. And my last point is, okay, they are stealing it, but for God's sakes, we don't have to sell it to them. And that's where these export control licensing issues that I have jurisdiction, I've been very forceful with, look, we got to stop selling this stuff. I mean, SMIC and Huawei, we saw a major export control violation of SMIC getting American tools and machines to make microchips, semiconductor chips, and they've now been able to use those machines not for legacy chips, but for advanced semiconductor chips, 7 nanometer, right? So what they do, 7 nanometer goes into their Huawei phone. Apple is in China. I always warn them, you're not going to win doing business there. But guess what? The government said, we're not going to buy Apple phones anymore. We have our own Chinese phone. Sorry, Apple.
So what does that say about the current state of the US-China relationship?
I think you have to go in eyes wide open with Xi Jinping, and you have to study the man, just like you have to study Putin. What is he thinking? I mean, I talked to some of these people that have talked to Putin and Xi, and you have to study the man, his philosophy. You have to know that Putin thinks he wants to be like Peter the Great. He wants to bring back the glory of the Russian Empire. Chairman Xi, he wants to reclaim the throne of Chairman Mao. He wants reunification, what is rightly his, Taiwan, and he wants the South China Sea. He wants to build the imperial China, and that's his worldview. And so when you get yourself inside their head, then you have to think, what would deter this man from invading Taiwan? What can I do? Deterrence, weapons, economic deterrence is another one. 60% of the international trade goes through the Taiwan Strait. So really that deterrence is so key. And I worry, when we were there, we were surrounded by 10 battleships, 70 aircraft, or an aircraft carrier, 70 fighter jets. And I got sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party just for going to Taiwan. That shows you how aggressive they are, and we got to wake up. We got to wake up to the threat.
Some of your colleagues are actually, instead of planning a congressional delegation to Taiwan and other countries that you did, they're actually planning to go to China. I'm curious what you think of that. Is there some kind of benefit for being a lawmaker that you have the ability to speak more freely and more forcefully than maybe someone in the administration, or do you see absolutely no upside to doing that?
Well, of course, I won't be able to attend because I'm sanctioned. I'm not allowed to go into China. Look, I'm all for talking. I think it's healthy. What I'm critical of is the administration has made concession after concession just to get to the table. That's bad negotiation. It's like the Iran deal they just cut. It was a horrible negotiation. You don't make concessions just to sit down with someone just to then make more concessions. And that's really what I see is they haven't gotten anything out of these talks other than, a nice toast. And I think it's always good to have that conversation, but at what price? And you don't stop your export controls. You don't stop presidential drawdown to Taiwan just to have talks. So I question that. And I think they're feeding, you just can't be naive.
What will you, in an ideal scenario, what would you like to see out of a President Biden, President Xi meeting, which is expected to happen later this fall in the United States?
Well, Secretary of Commerce and I passed my CHIPS Act. That was to pull supply chain out of Taiwan, so we're not so reliant. And I'll get to your question in a minute, but this is why is Taiwan important? Well, if you don't care about freedom or democracy and human rights, there's another factor. TSMC. It produces 90% of the advanced semiconductor chips for the world. If, let's say, after the Taiwanese President Tsai's party wins, and Chairman Xi decides it's time, he will go in with a blockade. He will cut the sea cable to the island, massive cyber attack, and then he owns or breaks 90% of the advanced semiconductor chip manufacturing for the world. If we thought COVID was bad, without semiconductor chips, nothing operates. And that's why I introduced my CHIPS bill at the urging of the previous administration, really based on national security grounds to pull the supply chain out. For 20 years, we've offshored it to Taiwan. Companies doing business in China and they're stealing their intellectual property and they're building up their military apparatus with it. So I would say we need to stop doing that. We need to stop outward bound capital flows that go into AI and quantum research. And I think Chairman Xi only understands power. And he says often, democracy doesn't work. President Tsai, it's dysfunctional. I can make a decision like that. And so you have to understand what you're dealing with. He only recognizes power, and that's the same with Putin. And if you meet him with power and strength, I think he would have deterrence.
China does seem to be the issue on Capitol Hill where you do actually have bipartisan support and the potential of actually passing legislation. One of the issues is, as you just mentioned, the outbound capital flows. The administration put out an executive order that's going to probably take until next year to be implemented, and there's various proposals on Capitol Hill. Your colleague, Patrick McHenry, who chairs the House Financial Services Committee, was quoted as saying, if you oppose Beijing's state-owned enterprises, you want more Western investment, not less. Do you agree with that approach?
So I'm not, look, China's a big market. And I think, there's going to be business in China with China. We can't completely stop. I'm just more focused on the sectors that involve national security that could impact our military strength. I don't want us doing business and selling things to them that they then can build a hypersonic weapon with. I don't like selling things to them that they put in their spy balloons. You know, if you're talking about other things, that's not supply chain, national security relevant. The three I pick are critical rare earth minerals, semiconductor chips, and medical. If you're not in those sectors, then, you know, and the semiconductor is more the technology that would get into AI and quantum. We have to get to AI first. It's that important. It's like a Manhattan Project. I saw the movie Oppenheimer recently, and it's the race for AI is a very close analogy to that.
Yeah, it is. So what is your crystal ball on what actually will come out of this Congress given the competing proposals on what to do with outbound flows, and the administration, of course, having put forward its own proposal? What's your take on what will actually land on the president's desk?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist, so I'm a conferee to the National Defense Authorization on many issues, and that's one of them, is the outward bound capital flows. And so what and I talked to Senator Cornyn, he'll be, I think, the Senate conferee, one of them. And what we talked about was a combination of the financial services bill and his outward bound capital flow bill. So this would be, I think, if you combine the two, it's very strong, because McHenry's bill is basically a sanctions bill on various companies we know are tied to the PLA. It's not as much sector-based. So the problem with that, again, is that they'll change the name of their company and get off the list, but it's still operating. If you do it sector-based, then I think that's a cleaner way to do this. So I take McHenry's sanction bill, and then I combine it with John Cornyn's bill that we agreed needed to be strengthened after the White House executive order that actually did stop. It had prohibitions of exports into AI or semiconductors and quantum. I think we can go down that list sector by sector and prohibit the sale rather than just notification, which is what the current version of the Cornyn bill is. So I think we can strengthen his bill, put the sanctions piece in, and then we got a really strong countering China bill. I'm tired of seeing our technology ripped off and being used in their weapons.
Well, we'll stay tuned for what actually comes out of this building. You mentioned SMIC, which of course is a Chinese semiconductor company, and Huawei, which is their big company that just announced this new phone, which you mentioned was potentially made with a chip that was based on US technology. Do you agree? Is this worrisome to you? And do you agree with the Commerce Secretary that this actually isn't evidence that they can produce such a sophisticated chip at scale to make phones for the world, I guess?
But and she also has proposed, and don't get me wrong, I worked very closely with Secretary Raimondo on getting the CHIPS bill passed, and we're both very passionate. We worked very well. And maybe at some point I can get into what I think that bill is going to do for Austin and Texas specifically. It's going to be a huge boom economically to Samsung and all that. But I mean, she wants to have export control working groups within China. That's like going into the mouth of the lion and start negotiating on export controls. I just don't think that's very realistic and somewhat naivete. And so I don't think that's the best approach. The thing that I had hoped that Secretary Blinken would have gotten out of his visit, and this is hugely important, as you and I, we were in Indo-PACOM in Hawaii. Our Pacific commander, Aquilino, the admiral, he said, I just want a hotline. I just need a direct line to my counterpart in China. We can't even negotiate that. And that's dangerous because we saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis how having a hotline can de-escalate things. And what I worry, if our Pacific commander cannot call his counterpart in China, think about miscalculations. especially when you're talking about an invasion of Taiwan, that would be far worse than this Ukrainian conflict. Trust me, that would be World War III. Be Russia, China, Iran, North Korea against Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, UK, United States. We need that hotline to prevent a miscalculation of this size.
It seems like maybe what might make this more difficult now is that the Chinese defense minister seems like he was ousted. So,
and the foreign minister, who I've known, he was the ambassador here, became foreign minister, and 3 months later was ousted for baby with a journalist out of wedlock, and I guess that violates the one-child policy. I don't know, but he's gone. And
so you don't think we'll ever see those two again?
Well, we don't know. The defense minister is a mystery to me. I usually have pretty good sources and intelligence. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I know that obviously Chairman Xi's not happy with him, so he has to go. We just don't know where he is. Can you imagine if we didn't have a Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State in this country?
Yeah. I do want to open it up for questions. Obviously, we could go around the world on.
Yeah, if I could just say that on the technology piece, one of the, I talk a lot about threats and weapons, but one of the more exciting things is with the CHIPS bill, we're now seeing, the Samsung expansion up to $200 billion in Central Texas, Texas Instruments, a lot of technology in Texas. The University of Texas and Texas A&M, I've worked with them to do a joint venture, if you will, proposal to Commerce to make Texas one of the technology hubs for the nation. I think she's looking very closely at New York, and I've talked to Chuck Schumer about this, trying to partner in New York and Texas. She's already told me that the Austin area will be a technology hub because Samsung is there. What I'd love to see in the bill, I put a national center for technology and semiconductors. And, we may have 1, 2, maybe 4, up to 4. I'm really working hard with the universities who put more engineers out there than any others, and MIT does as well, to get that center, one of those centers in the Austin area. It'd be great for the state. And also you've seen Intel expand into Ohio, Micron into New York. The bill is working. We've had, hundreds of applications. The interest has been very high in the private sector. And we're seeing the expansions. The whole point of the bill is, again, to pull that supply chain out of Taiwan into the United States or an allied nation. And we're also seeing TSMC expand into Arizona, which is what we want.
We're just waiting for the Commerce Department to actually announce the awards for these individual companies.
And that would be November timeframe.
Yeah, okay. Okay, let's open up for questions. Let's see how we do that.
Hello, thanks. Representative McCaul, thank you for being here virtually. I was once your constituent when you were gerrymandered into West Austin, so lovely to see you. The question, I'm wondering if you can enter into my dream world where a moderate, responsible Republican congressman might gather 20 of his friends and walk into Hakeem Jeffries' office and say, look, my conference is broken. We need a government of national unity. We would like to sit down with you. Here's the things we demand. These are the committee chairmanships. These are the laws that must be brought up, bills that must not be. But where is the leadership that can get us out of this crazy mess that Kevin McCarthy is held hostage to and the nation is held?
And I like your characterization of my politics. I try to be the adult in the room and the rational guy. I think we have enough. I got 5 children, and babysitting is not my forte, and I don't have the patience sometimes. And sometimes I feel like, especially some of the newer members who don't really understand how it works up here. Just the lack of understanding of the process and what they're doing. And a lot of times it's irresponsible. I'll give you a good example. We put just the rule for our defense appropriations bill on the floor for the second time yesterday. Typically, this is the easiest vote of the Congress. You're voting for the military. You want to support our troops, easiest one, right? Guess what? Our own members brought down that rule. There are about five to seven that I don't think are reflective of the entire conference. That's sort of the tail wagging the dog. And, they have their reasons, but if we're unable to even pass a defense appropriations bill, what kind of leverage are we going to have with Chuck Schumer on the Senate side? And what message does that send to our military, our active duty troops, to our veterans? What message does that send to Xi Jinping in China, the guy who says democracy doesn't work? And then I look at the floor, we can't even pass a rule to debate the defense appropriations bill. And Chairman Xi is loving this because he's like, I'm right, democracy doesn't work. And guess who else likes that? Putin, the Ayatollah. Now, we haven't gotten into the $6 billion prisoner swap that's going to arm them in their terror activities. And also Kim Jong-un. I just think you can't play with fire with this stuff. And if you're going to shut down the government, you do it for a very good reason, and you have to have a very good reason. I don't think shutdowns really work for the American people or the government. It makes a political statement. And then oftentimes it's my party that gets blamed for it at the end of the day. So my message is, let's be responsible. Let's be adults here. You may not agree with me 100%. I'm not going to agree with you 100%. But Ronald Reagan, one of my favorites, he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I can than go off the cliff with my flag in my hand. Because what good does that get you if you got your flag and you just jumped off the cliff? Really nothing. Or you can get 80% of what you can negotiate. This institution was set up by our founding fathers, not as one of just partisan leaps off a cliff with your flag in your hand. It was set up for compromise. I know that's a dirty word in politics today, but you can't get anything done. I've been very effective because I do work across the aisle, because that's the only way you can really get things done, up here. And I'm concerned over the 20 years I've been here that we're losing some of that, and that's not good for the country.
Thank you. You
Thanks.
didn't really answer the question, though. Can you have an opportunity with your side is broken. There seems to be no compromise coming from the hard right of your conference. Is there a possibility of a negotiation with Hakeem Jeffries to find a common ground? You basically had lovely words here, but you're not answering the question on what can be done. What can you do to try to get us out of this place?
Right. Well, look, I think you talk about the supplemental, it has to be bipartisan, bicameral. I'm working on my PEPFAR reauthorization bill. That has to be bipartisan, bicameral. There are certain things that's just the way it operates. And at the end of the day, there can be some who will try to shut down the government, but at the end of the day, the process up here, it does work, and it's messy and it's painful. But at the end of the day, you're going to see the majority of the majorities on both sides passing something, passing an appropriation for the vital interests of our national security and our government. And that's the only way you can get it done. What I fear is that there are some who think that you can just do it with one party and not the other. Those are more messaging bills. Those are partisan messaging bills that have no chance of passing. And it's great to make your political statement, but you're not going to get anything accomplished at the end of the day unless you're willing to work, across the aisle. For Kevin McCarthy, if I'm him, I'm a little worried that I know that that's the only outcome that's how the movie's going to end. But if he does go to Hakeem Jeffries for Democrat support of a spending bill, then I worry very much, about the threat of this vacating the chair. And I got to tell you, I have never seen a speaker with so much patience. And he's really I think, done a very good job getting people to talk who would never normally talk to each other. And that's the only way we can work this thing out.
Congressman, you mentioned that the AI race and likened it to a Manhattan Project. After seeing the movie I also remember that turned into an arms race that created enough nuclear weapons between the two superpowers at that time to destroy the world. What type of guardrails or what types of rules or regulations would you suggest so that AI doesn't become akin to the nuclear arms race?
That's a great point. Look, I believe that our technology is still superior to China, but there is a race for this. And just like the Manhattan Project, we got there first, but it didn't stop our adversaries from getting it as well. I hate to be a gloom and doom kind of guy. I think there are a lot of great things about AI. You won't have to drive your car; it drives itself. A lot of great lifestyle things. When you get into the military applications of AI, that concerns me. There's a great Netflix documentary called Killer Robots, and it's essentially a military without people. Automated tanks, planes, drones, just machines and machine learning. So there are some who say we need to heavily regulate AI. I don't think that's the answer, because if we heavily regulate and bureaucratize it, it will stifle innovation. We need that innovation in AI that will bring a lot of great quality of life issues, but we also have to get there first for the military application, point of this. And I think we just have to have that competitive edge against our adversaries. And I do think we'll get there first, but will China eventually get it? They'll probably get it the way they got the hypersonic. They'll get, like they did the 7-nanometer chip through, machines that we sold to them, they used to make the 7-nanometer chip that now is in their Huawei phones. They'll eventually get it, whether they innovate it or whether they steal it from us. We just have to have that competitive edge.
I was asking, could we expect another base realignment and closure, another BRAC anytime soon, especially with respect to electric transmission lines and getting the build out we need without impacting training routes for our Air Force personnel?
Actually, I'm glad you brought up the BRAC base closure issue. I saw that as an example of a way to deal with an issue where electeds may need some political cover, but it's the right thing to do. In that case, it was, okay, what bases are we going to close? And every congressman that had a base didn't want their base closed. And what they did was they appointed an independent commission. But this was different. This one had an up or down vote to it. And the commission came forward with the base closures, and then it went to the Congress for an up or down vote. That's a mechanism I see that can be used for several things, including, 2/3 of our budget is on auto glide. It's on auto pass. So when we talk about the budget as we are right now, we're really just talking about 1/3 of the budget. That's what Congress appropriates, and that's what we have debates over. 2/3 of that budget is on auto glide. It's mandatory spending. It's not discretionary. It is not military. It's not national security. That's in the third. If we don't get the entitlements under control, they're going to eat up the entire federal budget. So in my view, I know that everyone that tries to reform entitlements to say save them, it politically, they're walking off the cliff, I guess. This BRAC idea, I think, is really a smart one. I've talked to the speaker about this, and he's really kind of energized about it because it does put it in the hands of experts, and it gives it to the Congress for an up or down vote. And I think it could save our nation from what is, we're moving into a very, very dangerous time where our debt is so massive that even our national security partners say it's one of the greatest threats we have. We're approaching, $30 trillion. And so I kind of like that idea. I just open that up to the audience, see if anybody has that same kind of reaction.
I hope that answered the question. We are having some difficulties with audio here, but I do have to wrap it now. Thank you so much for everyone watching in Austin. I hope you get some good food that we're not able to have today. Thanks for joining us.
I know Jenny's very bummed she's not in Austin right now at the Paramount, getting some great barbecue and great music, but I'll be there soon. And thanks everybody for participating.